Hello, and welcome to the WingTips Show. I am your host, Benjamin Hale, and today we'll be joined by retired Lieutenant Colonel Matthew Wehner for Episode 3, Above and Beyond. Lieutenant Colonel Wehner was commissioned in the Air Force through the Louisiana State University ROTC program in 1994 and completed Security Forces officer training at Lackland Air Force Base in Fort Dix, New Jersey in 1995. After serving 2 tours as a Security Forces officer and supporting 2 deployments in support of Operations Southern Watch and Desert Fox, Captain Wehner completed undergraduate pilot training at Vance Air Force Base in 1999. His first assignment to the C-130 was to the 61st Airlift Squadron at Little Rock Air Force Base, Arkansas, where he deployed 3 times in support of Joint Forge, Southern Watch, OEF, and OIF. Captain Wehner was then assigned to the 36th Airlift Squadron, Yokota Air Base, Japan. While at Yokota, he served in multiple roles, culminating as Chief of Operations Group Standardization and Evaluation. In October of 2006, Major Wehner was assigned as the Assistant Director of Operations and C-130J instructor pilot in the 48th Airlift Squadron, the C-130J FTU. In February of 2009, the 37th Airlift Squadron at Ramstein Air Base, Germany, began their conversion from the C-130E to the C-130J, and Major Wehner was selected for the reassignment to Germany to support the conversion. Originally, the Chief of Ops Group Stan Eval, Lieutenant Colonel Wehner completed his tour as the Director of Operations for the 37th Airlift Squadron. He was selected for reassignment to Little Rock Air Force Base for a 3rd tour in July of 2012, where he previously served as the 314th Airlift Wing Chief of Safety. Welcome, Retired Lieutenant Colonel Wehner. We're very glad to have you on Episode 3 of WingTips, Above and Beyond.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Ben. Hopefully I can provide you with some useful material.
Great. We're very excited.
For the detachment, yeah.
Awesome. All right, so we're going to start off with topic 1 here. Again, the academic mindset, right? So what types of academic skills proved to be most useful in your journey through college and your journey through your Air Force career?
Well, as I mentioned, Ben, it's been a while since I've been in an academic setting, but I will tell you that I think the skills that helped me be successful in my Air Force career are the same skills that helped me be successful academically in college or high school, whatever the case might be, and I would attribute that to goal setting. Right? I set a goal for myself, and I not only just set the goal, but I wrote it down, and what were the steps I needed to achieve that goal. And it was the same during my academic career, because I wouldn't define my engineering academic career in college as uber successful in terms of the grades, but the fact that I graduated with an engineering degree was successful. I was successful in that aspect in my mind, right? And I got there. I graduated with that degree. It was very difficult for me by setting goals and working hard to achieve them.
Right. So you mentioned the difficulty of your degree here. What are some ways that you would use those techniques, that goal setting, to keep yourself motivated?
I mean, to me, it was all about what the end goal was, which for me was to become an Air Force officer. You know, I initially signed up, so to speak, while I was watching the first Gulf War with Wolf Blitzer on CNN in 1990-91, right? Yeah. And so for me, the end goal was always to become an Air Force officer and leader in the military. And so, I kind of always focused on that end goal and tried to achieve and make that, graduate with that degree so that I could ultimately achieve the goal of becoming an Air Force officer.
Right. It was a means to an end. Right. It's,
sure.
Yeah, for sure. So you always have to keep that larger picture in mind. That kind of helped you.
And it was a struggle. And to stay motivated, it was always with the end goal in mind.
Right. Even the most successful, highly successful academic, minds, they're going to have that lack of motivation at some point. And
Sure.
it's definitely important to keep that motivator, that end goal in mind. So yeah, no, I definitely agree.
Yeah.
So can you describe some ways that developing routines would play into your academic success either in the Air Force, in college? So you did go to Louisiana State University for Bachelor of Science in Electrical Engineering.
I did.
So I'm sure that routines definitely helped you out with that massive workload that you probably had to take on, right?
I did. I've always been. I'm not very good at sitting around doing nothing. Mm-hmm. And so I've always had a full plate, to be honest with you, Ben. For me in college, it wasn't just my engineering workload, but I also worked a job. I was a waiter at a restaurant in Baton Rouge, Louisiana.
Wow.
I was in ROTC, obviously. I played a lot of pickup basketball, probably too much. But to me, as your earlier interviewee mentioned in your episode 1 podcast, to me it was truly about time management.
For sure.
And I know that seems cliche, but I think she hit the nail on the head. To me, it was about scheduling your time and knowing when you had things going on. Just sticking to that. Routines, yes. There was never downtime for me. Rarely in college. I'm not saying I didn't have a good time.
So would you say that stress kind of motivated you in a way through college? That constant pressure, would you say that stress would be, it could take away, but also it sounds like it was a motivator to you at some point.
Sure. I think, as anybody will tell you, that stress is never always a bad thing, right? I think there's a curve, and at some point you'll fall off that curve. It gets to be overwhelming. But for me, it never did get to be overwhelming, because to me, it was all about balance. If you spend too much time doing any one thing, it's going to get to you, right? So for me, although academics were very stressful, I tried to balance my time doing other things so that I never fell off that stress curve.
That's great. Awesome. So can you walk us through what a typical study session either in the Air Force or in college would look like for you? Did you go to a coffee shop, hang out with friends to study? Would you go to the library? Just walk us through a few examples and techniques that you might have used.
Yeah, I think, again, going down to it's just a division of time, right? So the technique that works best for me, because, I'm very busy all the time and maybe even have a slight bit of ADHD, to be honest with you.
Yes.
So for me to break up an hour and say, look, Matt, in an hour, you're going to study 40 minutes, right? So, spend 20 minutes, 15 minutes studying and take a break. So within that hour, you accomplish 40 minutes, but you don't spend the full hour because you got to give your mind an opportunity to take a break.
Right. So those breaks are just important as the actual studying portion.
Absolutely. And on an individual level, that's how I found success.
Okay.
From a group perspective, I'm not sure coffee shops were as big as they are now.
Right. That might be a recent.
When I was in college. But I found, I had some friends that were in my ROTC detachment. Actually, a good friend of mine who was also a major. And he and I spent many a long night in the computer lab or studying for tests. And without Mike Vaccaro, I don't think I would have been as successful at EE as I ended up being, or at least graduating with that degree.
Yeah, for sure. Using friends, especially in similar majors, it can just do profound things for your academics and getting that different mindset, right, from that other external source.
Sure,
can definitely help.
But I will tell you that as I transitioned to something that I truly loved, and that's what I would tell most of the people that are going to listen to this would be, from a degree perspective, choose something that you really, really love to do. I wouldn't say that I chose that degree because I really love that. Mm-hmm. I chose it because it gave me an ROTC scholarship, and I stuck with it for that reason. As I transitioned to my Air Force career and I started doing something that I truly loved, I would say what worked for me from a study perspective was getting together with, let's use pilot training as an example. I mean, we had a great group of guys in my pilot training class. We'd all get together. We were all enduring the same pain that was pilot training at the time. And those group study sessions really did a world of good for me when I was going through pilot training.
For sure.
But I think the passion towards what you're doing, ultimately, that's what led to my success.
It's the ultimate motivator.
It is. I mean, you got to pick something that you really love. And for me, that was flying in the Air Force. And,
that's great.
And then it became really easy for me to be motivated and stay motivated. And to study is choosing that correct career path.
Great. Yeah, so I'd love to move on to your, you had a very prestigious career, 21 years in the Air Force. I'd love to talk about your time spent transitioning from the C-130E to the J variant.
Sure.
So if you could talk about some of the academic logistics behind training from one platform to the next platform for our young aviators here, and what that might look like for their careers.
Well, I'll tell you, flying the C-130E, which were built in the early 60s, really laid a great foundation for success, because the mentality in the C-130E community, or the C-130 community at the time, was kind of a success, not at all costs, but when you're flying airplanes that old that tend to act in a certain way, they laid the foundation that you need to know a lot of things about the way the aircraft worked from a systems perspective. And not only that, but we hand flew the aircraft an awful lot more than your typical, I won't talk about the fighter community, but I will say from a heavy aircraft or large aircraft perspective, the 130 guy was a hand flyer, especially in the E-model community. So with that systems knowledge and hand flying experience, you move on from an airplane that is not overly automated to the newer version, which is the C-130J, built and designed in the 90s, introduced into the Air Force in the early 2000s, fully automated. You lose your flight engineer, you lose your navigator, but the foundation that was laid in the C-130E of attention to detail, learning the systems, and hand flying was key to a successful transition. And, from your original question was about, the training environment. Would you
yes,
say,
sir.
State it again?
Yeah. So just how did that training environment look, right? So how was it? How were the systems different? How did you take that knowledge and those skills that you learned in the E, which sounds like a lot more mechanical, right,
Sure.
of a flying experience than the J? How did you help yourself and help others transfer that knowledge from that platform onto the J? What were some methods that you used to accelerate that training?
Yeah, I'm not sure I was the best at it, to be honest with you, Ben. I mean, I think, we all embrace the technology maybe to a fault. But as I continued to fly the J model, which was a lot more automated, right? I mean, you could take off before the gear's even in the well, have it on autopilot. But what I learned over time, as I began to teach young pilots how to fly the airplane, because I spent 2 tours in the C-130J FTU at Little Rock Air Force Base, was to cut that out. Right, and to go back to my roots,
back to the basics,
and to fly the airplane, right? And not let the automation fly you, because I watched guys struggle with that very thing, right? I'm just going to do what they're teaching me up here in the simulators, which is just to raise the gear and put the autopilot on. And I just would tell people, knock that off and fly the airplane. Don't let it fly you. So I think, as the Air Force gets more technological, I think and I think you'll find this in the airline industry as well, you got to go back to your roots, and you can't let the automation control what you're doing. You have to control it.
Right.
Because you still got to be a pilot.
Yeah. So setting those building blocks, super important for new pilots, right? And anyone in that sort of setting there, probably.
Yeah, and I think the more complicated things sometimes get, whether it's technologically or in your life, I think you just got to return to the basics, back to basics. And that's, for me, what it became after a short period of time flying the J, was watching that happen and realizing that the foundation that had been laid for me in the old venerable C-130E needed to be more emphasized.
So, Mr. Wehner, you talked about some failure that you had in that pilot training from the E to J variants. Can you describe some ways that you were able to alleviate stressors in that training, and some ways that you were able to identify them and reroute to a different course and find success then?
Sure. Yeah. Before I do that, since you're talking about academics in college, I did experience some failures in my college academic career.
Oh, for sure.
And as I talk to your fellow cadets and to my kids who are in college as well, as I mentioned, I struggled a little bit with my engineering degree. I did manage to graduate, which I was proud of. But when I experienced a failure there, I would use the resources available to me, right? And that involved an awful lot of time spent in the professor's office, asking him or her what it was going to take for me to be successful in this class.
Right. So those office hours were key in success. Yeah. No, I'm definitely making those one-on-one relationships with your professors.
Absolutely. Because at a big university, you can become just a number. So if you don't take the situation in your own hands, grab by the bull by the horns, then you'll be just a number to that professor.
Right. You have to be proactive with your studies.
You got it.
For sure.
Yep. And as you mentioned, the failures in the academic setting in the Air Force, I'm not sure I'd classify those as failures, just little nuances that needed to be dealt with. And I think we tackled that from a team perspective, right? Because the flying training unit at Little Rock Air Force Base was truly a team. It consisted of a lot of retired C-130 operators who were your sim instructors, and then the students would eventually come down to us on the flight line to actually fly the airplane. So when we get them down there and experience these types of things, these failures, if you want to call them that, we'd have regular feedback sessions between the contractor up on the hill, so to speak, which is where the sims were, literally up the hill at the base, and we talk about what we are seeing on the flight line, so that we can make adjustments, so that they could make adjustments the way they were teaching students in the simulator.
Great, yeah. There's constant corrections.
You got it. Constant feedback, constant improvement. That's what it's all about, right? Is always trying to get better. And I think we did a pretty good job of that at the flying training unit at Little Rock.
Great. That's fantastic. So I'd like to transition into your career now with avionics, specifically with the C-130J. I'd like to talk about some of the integration techniques that you've used, some of the training that you're implementing right now, and how you're able to use these aforementioned academic techniques to find success in your career currently.
Sure. I am now retired. I decided for family reasons not to continue to fly. And so I took a job here at Wright Pat, originally in the T6 program office, which a lot of your classmates will probably fly first.
Soon to be pilots on the T6.
You got it. And then after a couple of years, I moved to where I was more comfortable, which is the C-130J program office. And right now I'm the cockpit evaluation and prototyping team lead in the program office at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And so as we were talking a little bit off camera there, I do work with Lockheed Martin, and we just recently released the most current version of the C-130J software, Block 8.1.1. Again, some of your fellow cadets might go on to fly that someday. But as I've transitioned to the job I'm in now, and reflecting on what I've done in the past, in terms of being an FTU instructor, what I've found here at Wright Pat is the knowledge level is not what I thought it would be. So I've just tried to use my background and my experience, which consists of over 17 years of flying that airplane, not necessarily the J model variant, but the C-130. And I've tried to educate the workforce here, and not to maybe bring them up to my level, because I don't know that you can replace easily 17 years of experience or impart that on someone. But I've tried my best to develop materials, training materials for my fellow engineers that'll help them develop a better understanding of how the pilots use the systems in the airplane.
Great. Well, that sounds really, really awesome with your integration there. So what would be some things that you've noticed specifically with these new pilots? What are some areas that they're just really struggling with, and how have you been able to identify that with the learning process?
Yeah, I think we've touched on it already. I mean, I think, again, you fly a T6. I mean, I think the Air Force version of the T6 is a little bit different than the Navy. It's not as integrated. So you fly a lot hands-wise, hand flying in the T6. For those that move to the heavy aircraft track and fly the T1, there's the advantage to, there's the opportunity to use the automation again, right? And I hate to overly simplify it, Ben, but I'm a keep it simple kind of guy, right? I live by the KISS principle.
For sure.
You've got to continue, as airplanes are modernized, you have to continue to fight to maintain your basic skill.
Right.
And you just cannot, as I watch, I'm a big fan of, maybe it's a little bit macabre, but the show Air Disasters on the Smithsonian Channel, I think it is.
That's great. Yep.
I watch a lot of those guys, and a lot of those episodes are focused on guys that let the automation fly them, and accidents happen that way.
Yep.
And so I just don't think I can overemphasize enough the need to not let it fly you.
For sure. The education is important. It's important that you start from the bottom and you remember those basics, right, with your training?
Absolutely. I mean, I think when you first get in the Air Force, whether you're a pilot or not, when you're a lieutenant, you got to get in the books, regardless of what your job is. And you have to, some of the jobs, I didn't start off in the flying world. I started off as a security forces officer for 4 years.
Okay.
What I didn't like about that job was that I was supervising airmen, and this will be the case for a lot of the lieutenants or the cadets that get commissioned. Not everybody goes on to fly in the Air Force, but you'll be supervising airmen who have a lot more experience doing the job that you're supervising them to do. I didn't necessarily care for that, which is why I didn't see myself spending a whole lot of time in the security forces world. But the need, when you do that, to get into the books and know the job that way, and then to go out and experience what your young airmen and young NCOs are experiencing. And for a security forces guy, that was working the gate, that was working the flight line, that was working in Headquarters Air Intelligence Agency. For me, that was getting out and walking in their shoes and actually doing the job they're doing, so that I could speak with relative experience, maybe not as much as they were able to, about what they went through on a daily basis, so that I could represent them to my commander a little bit better. But again, I think it, just like I said with the 130, where the foundation of knowing the systems, I think led to some future success for me in a more modern version of the airplane. You getting in the books as a young lieutenant and striving to know everything there is to know about your particular job, because as you get older, those opportunities to be in the books as you graduate to other leadership roles or supervising more people, those opportunities to study and to get in those books become harder and harder to come by, because the busier and busier you get, and the level of expectation for you is greater, right? So yeah, I mean, dive in when you become a lieutenant.
For sure. Start early.
Immerse yourself.
Yep. Totally agree. Mr. Wehner, so you mentioned that you had a couple jobs in the Air Force, security forces, and you obviously flew C-130s. This obviously took a lot of leadership, right? You were probably organizing a bunch of different groups of people. Can you describe some instance that you were able to educate someone on leadership and pass your qualities of leadership on to maybe another airman or a coworker, something like that?
Ben, I read your question ahead of time, and I look back upon my 21 years of service, and I struggled to find an instance where I had somebody working for me who was struggling in the area of leadership. I mean, I guess that speaks to the quality of the people I had working for me, because I actually didn't ever have to pull somebody in and tell them, you know what, your leadership needs some work, and here's some things I needed to tell you to improve. What I will say is, you learn an awful lot about leadership from watching people. And I'm not just talking about watching people do it right. I think more often than not, you learn an awful lot about leadership from watching people do it wrong.
For sure.
And not that I work for a whole bunch of those people in the Air Force, but I did have the opportunity to work for people who I would not consider to be the best of leaders. And as I mentioned, I think I learned more from watching them do it the wrong way. Not that I didn't learn from people who were doing it right, because I obviously did. But I told myself when I watched those people, I'm going to do the exact opposite.
Right. So those negative examples really were the guiding factor.
I hate to say they were powerful. Not to say that, again, not to underemphasize, because I worked for a lot of great people who I emulated in the Air Force. I had more good leaders or supervisors in the Air Force than I had bad. But I would just encourage people to watch and to soak it in. And I'm not just talking about at the officer level either, because again, some of your fellow cadets will move on to careers where they're one of 2 or 3 officers in an entire unit. You can learn an awful lot about how to lead by watching NCOs, and that was certainly true of me in the security forces world. And what I heard a lot, and I'm sure a lot of your fellow cadets who will become future lieutenants will hear, is listen to your NCOs. So they've got, and I did. I mean, I strive to find the NCO in the unit who was well respected, whose airmen listened to them. And when you find that NCO in your unit, watch them.
Great. Yeah, so what are some ways that you continue to take those qualities of leadership from those NCOs and educate yourself or educate others? Maybe it's at Wright Pat or with your family. What are some key takeaways that and areas that you continue to use from those experiences?
Yeah, I mean, some people are in leadership positions and they're merely in the position and they lead by position. In other words, I'm the man, you're going to listen. But I find the most effective leaders, and what I've tried to do is always be, I read a book, and if I could put a plug in, called The Servant. And so I'd encourage anybody that wants to go out and and it's about servant leadership. So I've strived to be a good servant leader, and the gist to me of being a good servant leader is, giving people what they need. Right? And that isn't what they want. And there's a difference.
Right.
It's what they need. And that could be a good swift kick in the ass, a course correction, if you will. It could be a pat on the back. But it's trying to give people what they need. And I've tried, as I advance into formal leadership positions in my Air Force career, I always would go back and read that book and strive to be a better servant leader.
That's great. Yeah, definitely taking some of those topics of, you definitely, they're not, the people that you're leading are not always going to want to exactly identify with what you're putting out, right? But it's those things of identifying consistent and proficient topics to apply to your team that can definitely find success.
Yeah, and ultimately, I think it comes back to what we started talking about, right? Which was, there's always a goal in mind, right? So you, as an operational leader, certainly have things you want to achieve. So it's about getting buy-in, right? And so what are the goals for the unit? Some of them are pretty straightforward. Let's go win a war. Let's go drop these guys off. Some of them are less concrete, right? And so for those less concrete things, the good leaders, I think, are able to motivate people to do things they don't necessarily want to do. And I think that comes with getting people's buy-in. What the key to that, I think, is communication, right? It's not a democracy. but you certainly have to get people involved in the setting of those goals and get their opinion on what it's going to take to achieve them. But ultimately, you're the leader, so you decide on the path forward to get there.
Right.
And you may not all agree. But as long as you're communicating with people and going, hey, here's the goal, here's the path we're going to take, and get people's buy-in, I think you'll be more successful as a leader if you do that.
For sure. Being clear, identifying, that seems to be a major topic with how you found success in all of these ventures. Just identifying the issue, right? And taking your logical process to fix that, especially with a team of people.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I inherited a unit at Little Rock Air Force Base in 2013 whose morale was pretty low. It was, as I mentioned, the flying training unit at Little Rock Air Force Base. And I wanted to figure that out. I knew who the prior commander was. I'd heard things about the way the unit was being run. But when I stepped foot in the door and took over, I tried my best to sit down and talk with people and get their opinion on what it was that needed to be done. And ultimately, I think we were successful there because of that open line of communication, right? I mean, you figure out people just need to be treated with respect, and that was it, right? I mean, the mission was the mission. Manning was short, so I'd listened to people. I tried to lead by example. I got out there and did the job they were doing. Manning was short. If they needed an extra sim instructor or an evaluator pilot in the sim, I went and did it to try to let that captain stay home with his family for that night. So, open lines of communication. Yeah.
Great. That's perfect. Well, thank you very much. We appreciate your time. Thank you for coming out and joining us on WingTips. We really appreciate you describing your whole process of leadership, how you implemented these important topics. Communication definitely is key. I think that's the big takeaway here, and we appreciate all your time. So thank you very much, Mr. Wehner.
You bet, Ben. And if I could, I mean, for me, for your fellow cadets that are considering a career in the Air Force, if I could, before we go, Ben, I would just say, what a great opportunity. The Air Force did a whole lot more for me than I ever did for it. And I couldn't be prouder to have served my country for 21 years. So I appreciate the opportunity to speak to your fellow cadets, and I wish them the best of luck in their future endeavors, because it's a great life.
Great. Well, we thank you very much. Thank you for coming out today. Thank you for your service, and have a great day, Mr. Wehner.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks, Ben.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
it.